Governments in developing countries are increasingly running development assistance programs where they're trying to distribute aid of various types to their poorest citizens, right? So even though we may think of aid to the poor as something coming from rich to poor countries, in fact, most of the aid to the poor is actually coming from and administered by developing country governments themselves. But when a government wants to give aid to its poorest citizens, it has this fundamental challenge of how does it figure out who's poor? So in developed countries where everyone is roughly paying taxes, or at least filing taxes, the government can use people's incomes through the tax system to figure out who's poor. But in a developing country where most people are not paying taxes or not part of the tax net, that doesn't work. But broadly speaking, there are a couple of different approaches that you can try. And so what my co-authors and I have done is worked with the government of Indonesia to run various experiments to try to figure out which of these different approaches is most successful in reaching the poor households. The first experiment we did contrasted two approaches. One is called a proxy means test, and the other is called community-based targeting. In a proxy means test, since the government can't observe your income directly, and if it just came to your house and said, hey, please tell me your income, people might lie about it, especially if they knew that if they said they were poor, they were going to get all kinds of benefits. What the government does instead is it conducts a census, or a census of everyone it thinks might be poor, goes door to door to millions of households, and the census enumerators basically write down a bunch of observable assets of what they can see. So they can write down how big your house is, what kind of roof you have, what kind of walls you have, whether you have a motorbike, whether you have a television, things like that. And from those variables, they can predict your income. And so that creates what's called a proxy for a means test, or a proxy means test. Second approach that the governments can do is they can use what's called community-based targeting. In community targeting, they can go to the village and say, look, the central government and the national capital, we don't know what's going on in this village, but maybe the local community leaders actually know who's poor and who's not. And so rather than try to predict it formally through a proxy means test, they just say, look, we think there's about 100 poor people in your village. You just tell us who the 100 poorest people are, and we'll give them the slots for the program. So there are pluses and minuses of both approaches. Proxy means test is more data-driven, but it doesn't use kind of this local knowledge. On the other hand, the community approach, could use that local knowledge, but it also might be subject to capture. For example, maybe the village head, instead of telling the government who's really poor, puts his nephew and his uncles and his cousins or whatever on the list. So we tried to evaluate this using a randomized controlled trial. And what we found is actually there's a bit of a trade-off. On the one hand, if you just try to measure people based on their actual per capita consumption, how much they're sort of consuming per month, which is a reasonable measure of poverty, the proxy means test does a bit better. Not a huge amount better, but a bit better in identifying the people who are the poorest. So the data-driven approach sort of, which is aimed at finding the poorest household, does in fact find people who are a bit poorer. On the other hand, when we do the community-based approach, we find that the people that get put on the list by the communities are people who self-identify as poor. So the reason we find that the proxy means test is actually doing a bit better at sort of matching consumption, it's not because the communities were putting on their nephews or uncles or cousins or other kinds of elite capture. Instead, what the communities were doing is they had a slightly different notion of kind of what it means to be poor, and they all sort of agreed on that. It agreed with what people felt themselves, and therefore when they asked to produce a list, they were using their local information, but also they were using this slightly different notion of kind of what it meant to be poor. And so from the central government's perspective, there's kind of a trade-off. If the central government says, no, we have a strong view of what poverty is, and we want to hit the people whose consumption is the lowest, who have the lowest incomes, essentially, that the proxy means test may work a bit better. If you want to hit the people whose themselves kind of are locally judged to be poorest, the community-based approach may work a bit better.